Hi, I'm Francesco Campoi, and this is Just for Funk. Welcome to episode number 33 of Just for Funk. You might have noticed that there was no episode 2 weeks ago. There was a very simple explanation for it. Notably, I forgot to plug this thing. So I ended up with a great video, but with zero audio. So that's kind of hard to edit. So yeah, I decided to be a little bit a bad person and basically postpone the whole thing by 2 weeks. Why didn't do it faster? Well, at the end, I will give you some explanations, and actually I'll give you also some links to things I've been working on lately. Hopefully they're exciting to you. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about CORBA. Yes, about CORBA, not COBRA, but CORBA. 2 weeks ago, we talked about COBRA, and I'm going to be mixing these two things all of the time. But 2 weeks ago, we talked about COBRA, which is the CLI framework for Go. Super simple to use, very nice, very opinionated, but when you are building something from scratch, I would definitely recommend checking it out. And if you have not watched the video, it is a great moment to go watch it. It should be somewhere around there. There's a link that appeared right now if I didn't forget to add it, which is possible. If you see that no link appears there, it's because I forgot, so send me a message or something. So I posted about that video 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago already, and I posted and I said, hey, I hope that you all enjoy this video about COBRA. And someone said, oh, I misread this, I thought you were doing an episode on COBRA. No, about CORBA, which, you know, it would have been fun. So what I decided to do was, I'm going to be, I used to be a developer advocate. I like to do developer marketing and stuff like that. Hashtag developer branding, hashtag growth hack. In a great moment of guerrilla marketing, I decided to write this tweet right here. And 1 hour later, I wrote this other tweet right there. And a couple hours later, I actually got 1,000 likes, which, maybe next time I should say 10,000 just in case, because I realized that my audience loves me or hates me. I'm not really sure, but they really wanted me to do an episode on COBRA. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So without any more introduction, I hope that sounds fun to you, because it doesn't to me, but let's get started. So welcome to 1991. Michael Jackson is breaking all records with his song Black or White.
I'm not gonna spend my life being a color.
Tell me you agree with me when I saw you kicking dirt in my eye.
Great song. At the same time, the internet keeps on growing. We've reached almost 1 million computers on the network, which is pretty amazing. I'm pretty sure we're really, really far from that number now. So 1 million computers on the network back then. At the same time, Linus Torvalds releases the first version of Linux, which is pretty amazing. And your dear Just for Funk host is celebrating his 8th birthday. Great picture that my mom sent me when she heard I was doing an episode about these years. So back then, even though the internet started to be quite mature, it was not that spread out, and people were building programs to communicate over networks, not necessarily the internet, but networks. And in order to do this, basically every single programming language had a different framework, which, it was fine unless you were actually trying to communicate between a server reading, let's say, C and a server reading, I don't know, like Prolog or even Java, which existed for a little bit already. So that was a big problem, and some people tried to come up with an idea. One of the efforts that came out, super interesting effort, was from the Open Source Foundation, and they came out with Distributed Computing Environment, also known as DCE, which later on gave birth to 2 projects. One of them I'm sure you've heard about. The other one you've heard definitely about it if you've done some Windows development. One of them, the Windows one, is DCOM, Distributed Component Object Model, that basically tries to solve the same problem for multiple languages but not multiple platforms, because it only works for Windows, which is also one of the reasons why it didn't end up being that successful, because it only worked on Windows. And even though Windows was bigger back then, it was not big enough to gain the whole market over multiple platforms when you only support one. The other project that came directly from DCE is called ODBC, which I'm sure you've all used at some point in one shape or another, but it was basically an effort on standardize the way we access databases. and ODBC stands for Open Database Connectivity. And while these were pretty good efforts, it is far from being as widespread or standardized as REST is today, right? Like we all know HTTP and everything. It's a very good way to to create APIs on top of them. But back then that didn't really exist. The internet was young and we were building other things. So at that point, there's CORBA. And CORBA appears, it is created in 1991. So yeah, I was 8 years old back then. And basically what we're trying to do is solve this problem of communicating between computers that are across a network. They may be using different languages, they may be using different platforms, and still we want to have a way as easy as possible and as secure and many other things as possible. There was a lot of things that they were trying to solve at the same time with a single protocol. And that protocol is called CORBA. Surprisingly though, in 1991 with CORBA 1.0, the first version, they actually forgot about the fact that the main thing of CORBA was the fact that it should work for multiple languages, and it only worked for C. So I'd say kind of a fail, or maybe a different conception of what a MVP, a minimal viable product, was back then. But anyway, it was not very successful, and it was created, by the way, by a group of people called OMG. Great name, which actually stands for Open Object Management Group. The OMG realizes that that is not a perfect solution. So 6 years later, in 1997, they come back with a new version, which is CORBA 2.0. For reference, in 1997, we had great songs covering things like and also one of my favorite songs ever. This version of CORBA, not Barbie Girl, supported more than one language. It actually supported easily C++ and Java, and also had support for many other languages, including Smalltalk and Prolog and many others. And this started to gain quite a lot of success, to the point that basically everyone that was developing distributed systems back then had heard about CORBA, probably had used it, and probably if you ask them, had hated it. But before we start talking about why it didn't work, let's talk first about what it actually is. Okay, so CORBA stands for Common ORB Architecture. And common architecture doesn't really mean much. It just means basically there is a technical specification. So you could have common architectures for anything. Here it's a common architecture for ORB. What is an ORB? ORB stands for Object Request Broker. And an object request broker is basically the same thing as RPC. What is RPC? Remote procedure call. All of the three words anagrams that you can find. So RPC stands for Remote Procedure Call, and it is the same RPC as you might see in things like gRPC, right? Which I've done a couple episodes on them, and if I remember correctly, there will be a link right here. Anyway. The RPC, the whole point is that it will make calling remote procedures, so procedures that are, or functions or endpoints, if you wish, that are defined and provided by a different machine somewhere else, maybe in a different network, maybe in a different country, but it makes it look like you're calling a function locally. That is basically what a proxy is. So the way it works is super simple, is basically you write some code on the client, and you're basically calling a function, right? But actually, when you call that function, what's going to happen is there's going to be some data that is going to be sent through the network to some server. The server is a CORBA server, understands the request, decodes it, does something about it, and then sends back a response. And that's pretty much what it does. That's CORBA in a nutshell. As we said, we have, on one side we have servers, and on the other side we have clients. And those definitions are basically temporary, because a single application or a single component of an application can be both. It can act as a server and as a client at the same time. Simply, when you talk about the server, it's the one executing the service. The client is the one requesting it, right? And the way they communicate is through an API. Now, that API, the cool thing is that it is specified by using a language, which in this case, it's called the IDL, which is Interface Definition Language. And CORBA, the Interface Definition Language, looks like this. And if you had a look at it, and if you know CORBA, you will know that that is not CORBA. That's actually gRPC. CORBA is this. And as you can see, it looks a lot like Java and C++. There's a lot of similitudes here. And that's the point, right? Like this is coming definitely from Java. I don't know that much about the history back then, but I feel like CORBA, it was designed by people that wrote lots of Java and wanted to call other servers, right? It looks a lot like Java. There's exceptions. There's a lot of things that other languages might not even provide, which is a little bit of a problem. The IDL for CORBA is very heavily inspired by Java, I'd say. And it shows. But anyway, that's not a really big problem. That's not what caused all of the drama. Actually, I'd say that actually caused even more adoption from people writing Java. So why did I show gRPC a minute ago? Well, I was not confused because, I'm actually editing this video. This has happened later on. But I wanted to make the point that actually CORBA and gRPC are not that different, really. Sure, I think gRPC is much better. But the main difference is like basically CORBA and gRPC try to solve the same problem. But while CORBA provided way more stuff and it was way more complex, gRPC tried to keep it as simple as possible. And I think that that's something that has, basically it's the big difference between CORBA and languages like Java, not necessarily Java itself, or like Java Enterprise Edition and all these patterns and all of these things, which is like a lot of engineering going on in there, versus more modern approaches, not necessarily more modern, but more like Linux style of small pieces that communicate well and they're interchangeable. Like nowadays, you could see, for instance, gRPC doesn't manage all of the things that CORBA did because there's many other things that can be managed by other things. For instance, CORBA provides a naming service. That naming service basically provides a way to discover things over the network, etc. gRPC does not provide that. Instead, what you will do is use a different system. Like for instance, if you're on Kubernetes, it will come for free, or maybe you will just use simply DNS to fill that gap, that part of discovering or routing messages to some server that you might not really know where they are or who they are. So in the first versions of CORBA, the way this naming service worked was kind of weird and pretty complex. I've read a little bit on it, but basically it was they were trying to make it so it not look like Linux, but also they didn't want to look like Windows. So they ended up with a completely different solution, which is kind of weird. Later on, they actually migrated to a different version where they added the CORBA location, which really is a URL. So at some point, they end up basically saying, there's a URL here, which is a record locator. It's not really an HTML thing or HTTP. It's just some individual way of describing a name, and like as URLs is also hierarchical, where you can say, well, up to this point it's going to be stored in this server. Like for instance, I don't know, .com, it's going to be in a place, and then google.com is going to be something specific, and then you're gonna go look from there into more URLs. Not necessarily it could be one single machine, but that's the point of making it as scalable as possible, like DNS. I'm not going to discuss the whole specification of CORBA for a couple of reasons. One of them is I don't know it that well, and I had time to document myself. But surprisingly enough, the first version of CORBA, well, not the first version of CORBA, but the one we care about, CORBA 2.0, which was released in 1997, it contains 634 pages, and you can download it for free, which is really good. That's better than SQL, so that's something. But it is still a lot of content. And later on, with 3.3, which is the latest one that was released in 2012, it still has 500 and something pages, 532 pages, which is way too much for me to read for an episode, to be honest. But I will link it from the video. So if any of you wants to go and read those specifications, please enjoy it. And now to finish, I'd like to talk about why did CORBA fail, and especially what can we learn from it. One of the main reasons CORBA failed was the fact that it was incredibly complicated. It was designed by a committee, and in that committee there was a lot of different people with a lot of different interests. None of them was necessarily the fact that the framework would keep as simple as possible. Actually, nobody cared about that. Instead, every single provider of CORBA frameworks or CORBA implementations would add more features, and those features would just be created, like added to the specification, and then that's it. The problem is that those specifications didn't require of any implementation, right? Which means that to basically go with something that it would be similar for Go is like if I said, Go needs to have generics, and then you ask me, well, show me exactly how, and I'll go like, oh, this how, and I just write it down on a piece of paper. But I don't really try to implement it. I don't really get into the gritty details of the specification, which means that then that will be approved, and then everybody needs to implement it, which leads to hell. Basically, CORBA had a lot of pieces that were never implemented by anyone. And then the APIs that were approved were so complex that most people would not use them directly. And instead, there was frameworks built on top of that framework to basically pick and choose a piece of a section of the API that was kind of sane and make it so people could be able to use it. Like Enterprise Java Beans and all of these things. Those were basically things built on top of CORBA. So imagine that, like you come with the idea of creating a framework, and people, rather than using that framework, it's so complicated that people end up using frameworks on top of those frameworks, which again, they're not standard. So now you're breaking that standardization again, which means that all of a sudden everybody is complaining about it, because if you have two different implementations of CORBA, like a server that is implemented with some provider of CORBA, but then the client uses a different technology, also CORBA, but a different vendor, all of a sudden it will not work, which that is a big problem. Also, different programming languages were slightly different and would not work. And the largest problem of them all was the fact that CORBA doesn't allow for versioning. So if you wanted to change an endpoint from version 1 to version 2, you had to change the server and all of the clients at the same time, which it's impossible, unfortunately. So there was some workarounds around it, but at the end of the day, it means that it was way too hard to use, way too hard to implement, and at some point became way too hard to sell. Also, what happened is that at some point, XML became the new hotness, and everybody was using XML. Actually, I used a lot of XML to the point that my master's thesis is on a meta programming language for templating for XML, known as Xtiger, and you can read an article and even the whole thesis written in French. So if you know French and you want to have a bad time, go read it. I will not ever again. But anyway, everybody was doing XML. CORBA is not built on top of XML. It actually predates XML. So when SOAP came and SOAP was using XML as the format to send the messages in, which actually meant that versioning was much better and much easier, all of a sudden people moved directly to SOAP. So then we got from CORBA to SOAP all of a sudden, and CORBA started disappearing. As I said, the latest version published was in 2012, but not that many people use it. Actually, if you're using it and you're happy with it, I'd like to hear more about it. I also looked for an implementation of CORBA in Go. There's no such a thing, which somehow makes me almost like happy, and it reassures me that, Go is not trying to re-implement that, which is good, because instead we should be doing some other things. So as we know, after CORBA came SOAP, after SOAP came REST, and after REST, well, gRPC. Not really. gRPC is one of the contenders. REST is still there, doing very, very well. But that's why I'm going to be talking about gRPC and REST and all of these things, but not that much about CORBA ever again. So anyway, that's the end of the episode. As promised, I'm going to end with a couple news. One of them is not really a piece of news. There's two people that I admire that have been through bad times lately. So I wanted to send a big shout out to Ashley McNamara, who is awesome and an awesome golfer, an awesome person, and also an awesome designer. She made this t-shirt, which I love. But also to Simone Geertz. She's the queen of shitty robots, and she had some really sad news about she's going through some medical problems. I'll link to the video she posted too, so you can watch it. And anyway, I'm sad that some of my friends are going through bad problems, so I just wanted to send a big shout out to the both of them, telling them that they're a big inspiration. Other than that, other pieces of news, in the future, I'm going to be having a little bit more trouble recording these videos, mostly because I bought a house and that takes time off my schedule. But I'll do my best. I'll try to keep it every 2 weeks. And actually, I'm already working on the next episode, which will very probably be a code review. So as a reminder, if you have code reviews that you'd like me to do, or some projects that you like me to use, or any other topic or question or things like that you might want me to cover, feel free to send me a message on Twitter. My DMs are open on Francesc, or you can just simply put a comment on here, or maybe you can also use the form, forum.justforfunc.com, which I read every single time I'm preparing an episode looking for new ideas. Thanks to all the people that have ever sent comments or messages on Twitter or on the forum. I definitely look at those. I don't always reply because there's many of them, but I take them into account. So even though you might have sent something a long time ago, maybe in 2 weeks you'll have an episode on the topic that you asked for. So you never know. As always, thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and see you all in 2 weeks.